Who's in charge here? Can you picture like a dramatic TV show or a movie and somebody bursts into a room and there's a lot of people running around doing stuff and somebody says, "Who's in charge here?" Well, that seems to be what's raised up for us this last weekend of Ordinary Time. And it also seems to be a very appropriate question for what we've all been living through. How many of us have wondered that over the last 3 weeks since the election, over the last 8 months since the pandemic? Who's in charge here? To whom should we listen? Here in New York, I believe, like the mayor has the power to close some things and the governor has the power to close other things, like the schools and the restaurants. I can't keep track of which is which. They always seem to be in a fight with our president and our president-elect. Who's in charge now? When's that going to change? It's weird. And yet, it's a fair question. Does Dr. Fauci get to tell us to wear a mask or not, or when the vaccine is coming? We'd like to know. And in fact, what's happening this weekend is somebody else wants to know also. God wants to know. God is asking that question of me and of you today. Who's in charge here? Who's in charge not of the vaccine or of closing the schools? Who's in charge in here? Who's in charge of you? Who do you report to? Who do you listen to? We can see very easily by looking across our country, and you can probably figure out in a couple of minutes which TV channel people watch, right? News channels? You can figure it out pretty easily. Can people figure out about you and I that we come here on Sunday night? That we, as we say in our words, worship and adore Christ as our King? Who is in charge in your life? Long ago, I once heard a fairly wise preacher once say, there's two things you look at to see who's really in charge, or to see what really has hold of your life: your calendar and your checkbook. You'll know what you pay allegiance to. You'll know what really rules in your life if you look at those two things. So I actually do have the practice, and it's usually during Advent, of going back over my year, looking at my calendar. Nowadays I have to also include the photo albums, because sometimes I didn't write it all down oh, that picture reminds me of something. And I make that a kind of a spiritual exercise. Where have I really given my heart, my energy, literally my time over the last year? There's going to be quite a bit over the next few weeks of looking back over this year. Even in great years, that week between Christmas and New Year's, all the magazines and TV channels have those retrospectives about all the great stuff that happened. I'm wondering what they're going to do this year. All the wonderful stuff we experienced in 2020. Wouldn't it be great? Actually, if you think about it, as church, we get a little bit of a jump on the world. We're ending 2020. So we end this week, right? So our books, our liturgical books, we begin 2021 next weekend. Whew, that'd be great, all right? But as we go into the new year, who will be in charge? We're still wondering that on a lot of levels, but we don't have to wonder that in here. Who's in charge? And then the second big question that Jesus really makes a strong point in the gospel: what do you do about that? And do is the underscored word. What do you and I do as a result of Christ being our King, if in fact we can really sincerely say that? How does that manifest itself? Is it as obvious looking at Catholics or members of St. Paul the Apostle or who's ever watching online? Is it as obvious as it is figuring out if somebody's got a mask or a blue flag or a red flag, all that stuff? Now you might say, well, should we be labeling people like that? we should be truly living our faith. That I know. And Jesus makes it pretty plain here. So this is close to the end of Matthew's gospel. This is what we call his last big sermon. So the first one, the beginning of Matthew's gospel, perhaps the more famous one, the one on the Mount with the Beatitudes. And he starts by saying, you really should care for one another and love one another, in that sermon. And then here at the end of his ministry, he says, all right, so just so you know, I wasn't just kind of blowing smoke there. You will be judged based on if you've really lived this or not. So who's in charge here? Is it Christ the King? Is it me sitting on my own throne? Many days I probably act, let's strike the word probably, many days I do act as if I'm in charge of my life. And in this weird time of COVID-19, it's been probably a little easier to be kind of closing in on ourselves. Quite honestly, there's less opportunities to do the sort of things that we heard about in the gospel. Well, at first, even we priests weren't allowed to visit people in the hospital. But nonetheless, Jesus calls us out of ourselves, out of our quarantine, out of our isolation, out of me, towards anyone else in your life that could use a little something. These are basic things. Visiting someone. Now we can visit digitally. Zoom. Remember in the first couple months where we were having all those little fun, hey, let's have like a Zoom happy hour with our friends from college you haven't seen in a while. Oh, let's do this and that. Anybody else notice those sort of petered off a little bit? What about connecting with others in a simple way? Jesus is saying that we will be judged, but he's not making it like PhD level stuff. It's like caring for somebody. In fact, what they actually say is, Lord, when did we not care for your needs? And like Pope Francis has been reminding us, it's when we don't care about what's going on in the world that truly we are in a state of sin. So maybe as we move into 2021 and struggle a little bit with that question, maybe even each day, who's in charge here? We can also frame it in terms of, who can I help here? If God really is in charge, if Christ is my King, and he showed me how I'm supposed to follow him by getting down on his knees and washing people's dirty feet, well then, who needs that from me today, this week, this new year? Maybe if we actually live our faith, and many of us do, of course, but if we do a little bit of a better job at that, people can have less ambiguity that it's really Christ who is King. No matter who's sitting on our elected governmental thrones, no matter who's fighting over who can close what school or restaurant, you and I and people that see our charitable works and the ways in which we live the Christian life, they can know for sure who's in charge here. Christ, our King.